get started here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jesse. I assume that everybody's seeing my screen okay. Is that right?
Yep.
All right, good. So thanks for coming. We're going to go through some Rochester bike history today. I have a local history and museum background, but a lot of my work now is about bike history and community bike rides here in Rochester. So this is where my passions kind of come together. And this is going to be a fun event this evening. So if you're not familiar with Reconnect Rochester, this is our mission. We champion transportation choices that enable a more vibrant and equitable community. And this is going to be recorded tonight. I'm going to try to go through these slides as fast as I can. The good news is that it'll serve as a resource up on YouTube for a long time, we think. And if you ever have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to send them over to me. But let's dive right in. So I guess one of the premises of Evan's book in particular is that there were some American cities in the 1890s that had bike networks comparable to current cycling meccas like Amsterdam or Copenhagen. And the reason we're here tonight is because Rochester was one of those bicycle crazy cities and was even a groundbreaker in many respects. So you see the little clipping there in the middle from one of Blake McKelvey's books about Rochester. And he notes that Rochester during the 1890s was known as Cycletown, USA. And then the clipping that you see there over on the right-hand side, that was a Bicycling World editor that came to Rochester and said, I think Rochester is the greatest bicycle town in the country. A stranger visiting the city would think the whole place moved on wheels. Pretty cool stuff. So where does Rochester's bike history start? Well, it starts with the velocipede. And if you know your bike history, you know that this was known as the bone shaker. It had very rigid iron wheels. It was not comfortable to ride, but it appeared in Rochester very early in 1869. There was an exhibition at the Armory where people got their first look at this contraption. And not long afterward, there was an indoor skating rink on Allen Street that was converted into a riding school to teach people how to pedal and balance and ride these things. And the image that you see there is what a typical riding school from the era would be like. And because of the nature of this vehicle, you really, really needed a hard, level, smooth surface to be even remotely comfortable. And that's why it was mostly an indoor vehicle at that point. So it was expected that when spring opened in 1869, that these velocipede contraptions would be everywhere. And from the very beginning, Rochester police were instructed to get those things off of the sidewalks, which one of the most important points we can make tonight is that during this time period that we're talking about, sidewalks were the only smooth, hard surface that you could even bicycle on. So there were some local cyclists here that tried to prove to the world that the velocipede could be a practical vehicle, and they rode their velocipedes from Syracuse to Rochester, but the roads were just too rough for it to be useful. And so basically enthusiasm for cycling wanes for a decade. And there you see a picture of Main Street, just giving you a picture of what streets would have been like back in the day. They were muddy, they were mucky, horse feces. During the dry months, it would have been just dust getting kicked up everywhere. So the only place that velocipedes could go, the sidewalks, they were barred from. But when bicycling does make a comeback, it makes a really big comeback, and that came with the Ordinary, or the big-wheeled penny farthing, that high-wheeled front bicycle. And that hit Rochester about 1880. This had rubber tires, and the most popular brand in Rochester and elsewhere was Columbia bicycles, manufactured by Albert Pope. And it was mostly young men with disposable incomes that embraced the high-wheeled bicycle. It was very dangerous. Every time you rode it, it was very hard to come to a stop. And so going over the front of the handlebars was very common. And it was mostly young men, disposable incomes, willing to take that risk that gravitated to that high-wheeled bicycle. There you see an advertisement from Thompson and Kenfield that was on South St. Paul Street. Today we would call it South Avenue. That would be where the library is today. But city leaders throughout Rochester and throughout the country didn't know quite what to do with this large, silent, fast contraption that really started booming everywhere. So despite crashes being common, people formed clubs. And again, it was mostly men that were gravitating towards these high-wheeled bicycles, but each club had their signature badges, their signature uniforms. It was a sign of conspicuous consumption. Every club would find a suitable location for a headquarters where they could hang out and drink beer and maybe in inclement weather, ride their high-wheeled bicycles indoors where they could practice. So there's a picture there of the Rochester Bicycle Club, which it should be noted is different from today's Rochester Bicycling Club. Very similar names, but there's no continuity between the two organizations. And there were just a variety of bike clubs that popped up all over Rochester. I'll go through quickly here some prominent Rochester locations for bicycle history. A lot of group rides today in Rochester. They usually meet at Parcel 5 or perhaps Martin Luther King Park at Manhattan Square. But back in the day, the most popular meeting spot was definitely Washington Square Park. You can see there in the map that Monroe Avenue used to go all the way to Washington Square Park. Today, Monroe just becomes Chestnut and veers off a little bit. But many bicycle parades would start from Washington Square Park. Another important spot was the Washington Rink on North Washington Street. It was common for big bike rides to conclude at the Washington Rink, where they would have receptions. Whenever there was a bicycle exposition, and we had several bicycle expositions, they would usually take place at that North Washington Street rink where that parking lot is today. Rochester's first public park, I believe, was Falls Field, and the Rochester Bicycle Club at one point did have a track with raised corners for bicycle racing right next to High Falls, which was pretty cool. Of course, the most popular spot for really, really big bicycle events was Rochester's Driving Park up near, Maplewood Park and Lower Falls. Buffalo Bill Cody, when he would come to town for his Wild West show, he would do it from this driving park. And there were many, many big bicycle events that happened up there in that park. So a seminal moment in bicycle history was, of course, the 1887 Liberty Bill. And that's when bicycles became legally classified as vehicles. And because automobiles did not exist at this time, the language that they had to be compared to was being compared to carriages. And so the ruling was that bicycles were legit vehicles that had a right to the road. And because they had a right to the road, they were also subject to all the rules of the road. And by this point, the bicycle, political bloc was so strong that they could get some victories together, but it just demonstrated their power by that point. So again, it was mostly young men that gravitated to the high-wheeled penny farthing, but when the safety bicycle was introduced, that's when cycling opened up to everybody, and most importantly, women. There you see the beautiful mural that is on West Main Street in Rochester. Susan B. Anthony was an adopter of the safety bicycle, and she has that great quote that bicycling has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives freedom and self-reliance. We're also notable, Rochester is, for Elsa von Blumen, who became a winning racer from that period. And, it's really the safety bicycle that just opens up bicycling to everybody. It had pneumatic tires, and it's more or less the same exact bicycle that many of us ride today. Just a quick note here that George Eastman, noted philanthropist and prominent Rochester citizen. He was a bicycle nut. He was an avid rider. He biked all around Rochester, Massachusetts, all over Europe, seeing where he could set up future Kodak establishments. It's really how he got to see Europe for the first few times, was by riding his bicycle. Unfortunately, like early adopters of his era, he gave up bicycling after 1900 and he became an automobile enthusiast instead. And his enthusiasm for cycling just kind of drops off a cliff. I love that illustration there by Zach. And if you haven't taken the George Eastman bike tour, I highly recommend it. So again, Rochester went bicycle crazy in the 1890s. There were just so many bicycle parades, expositions, carnivals. The picture you see there is from the driving park racetrack. up west of Maplewood Park. And the newspaper clippings from this time are just littered with great fun, big bike events that made a lot of noise. I love that word that you see there in the bottom right, Callithumpian. I think that's a word that should come back in popular usage. And I think Rochester should have some Callithumpian bicycle parades once again. Robert, I would not have known this if it wasn't for your book, but you make the case in your book, Old Wheelways, that cycling's most important illustrator, Frank Hamilton Taylor, was from Rochester. And if you, Google Frank Hamilton Taylor, sketches, he just takes you into this world. And whenever I see a Taylor sketch, I just want to step into that world, but it just has a marvelous power to bring you in. And Rochester can be proud that this illustrator was born here. He later moved to Philadelphia, I believe. So the Rochester Union and Daily Advertiser is like, we had many newspapers back in the day, but if you want to go to one that had more bicycle content daily than any other, it was the Union and Advertiser. And it had a daily bicycling section. And every day they would call it something different, either Wheel Talk or In Cycling Circles or the Wheeling World, With the Wheelman, Bikeman's Corner, but a daily cycling page, because cycling was just consuming the city. Pretty cool. So in addition to a lot of northern industrial, cities, Rochester did some bicycle manufacturing. Not only did we manufacture bicycles, like you see there on the right, but the Sager Saddle Company, which is right now it's the parking lot across from Frontier Field and the downtown MCC campus. That's where that factory used to be that manufactured saddles and many other bicycle accessories, but we had a lot of manufacturing here. So the precursor to what would be, I guess, the old Rochester Cycling Alliance or Reconnect Rochester today, that was organized in 1889, and that was the Rochester Wheelmen's League, just to get people together for concerted action. And they ended up having a very strong effect in Rochester. So those are our forebears in the advocacy world. So in 1891, that's when the city of Rochester decided that every bicycle had to be registered and you needed to have a unique serial number for it. Many riders did choose to ignore it, even though they could face, fines and possible jail time. Around the same time period, there was actually a speed limit put on bicycles as well. So it's not all rosy picture stuff that we see in the rear view mirror here. Things got to a boiling point in 1896. At that point, the Rochester City Council decided to ban bicycles from the sidewalks. Again, they were getting so popular, everybody was bicycling, but the roads were still not that great for riding. So in 1896, to protect pedestrians, the council banned bicycles from riding on the sidewalks, which was, again, the only hard, smooth surface. And there were a lot of angry cyclists that rallied in Genesee Valley Park. Up to 10,000 riders showed up to protest that. In addition to protesting the sidewalk ban, they were protesting the speed limit on bicycles, along with the new ordinances requiring bells and lamps at night. So what comes out of this sidewalk ban is two very different movements, and these are really neat to dive into. So the first movement was what we call the Good Roads movement. And you have to understand that at the time, there was a general distrust of centralized government and, centralized public works. We're talking about the era of Boss Tweed and machine politics, and there was just a lot of corruption. And cyclists at the time proposed what was then a very radical idea: tax the public to pave public roads. And the largest, most powerful bike organization in the land, which is now the League of American Bicyclists, they got behind that Good Roads effort. And there you see some old literature. I have a copy of that Good Roads book from 1897, along with the cyclist roadmap of the Genesee Valley. But that movement failed to gain steam. And when it failed to gain traction, some cyclists decided to take the issue into their own hands, and they decided to go forward with what they called a side path movement. And that was raising funds to construct a network of recreational side paths to get cyclists out of the city and into quiet country lanes. So this was not necessarily about practicable bike lanes. It was not about getting people to work on their bikes. It was very much about getting city residents out into the surrounding countryside for leisure and recreation. And they viewed the construction of side paths as an object lesson of sorts, showing the value of good road surfaces. So at first, Rochester cyclists, a bunch of them advocated for taxing every single bicycle, but there was enough resistance to nix that idea. So they had no choice but to resort to organizing fundraisers and selling side path tags to fund that side path construction. The paths were patrolled to detect violators. You could get in trouble for riding on that side path network if you didn't pay annually to have that special side path tag. If you hop on eBay at any given time, chances are good that you'll find one of these old Monroe County side path tags. There were many counties throughout the country that had them. I got a Monroe County side path tag on eBay a few months ago for like $35 or $40, and it's a cool keepsake from the era that's worth having if you care about this stuff. So the side path movement really didn't start in Rochester. It started in Niagara County and Lockport, but Rochester definitely became the leader, par excellence when it came to the side path movement. There was a magazine that was published here, showing all the neat stuff that Rochester was doing. The very first side path convention was held in Rochester in 1898. And this is a way that we were leaders. People used to come to Rochester to see how this bike infrastructure was done. We used to be a leader in that respect. So here you see a little elevation view of what a typical side path would have been like. And you can see that the cycle path is distinct from the sidewalk. And at the same time, it's distinct from the gutter. It's distinct from the road. So much like we have the new East Main cycle track, it's pretty similar to that. It's distinct from the road. It's distinct from the sidewalk. There on the right side, you see a little tiny skinny path over to the side of Linden Street, which was one of these side paths to get cyclists where they needed to go. The great thing about bikes is you don't need a lot of space. You need a place for your tires and shoulder handlebar width to get through. That's all you need. So by 1900, 1905, we had a very, very sizable side path network to get you out into the countryside and out into nature. They started connecting nearby villages and towns. There on the left was a route for a 1896 group bike ride that had over 2,500 participants. And road by road, street by street, it tells you where they went to show off the side path network that they had at the time. So a popular activity that cyclists would do at the turn of the century is they would follow what is now the Genesee Valley Greenway out to Scottsville. And there were a couple of hotels that were very, very welcoming to cyclists. And so it was a very, very popular thing to do in the 1890s, early 1900s, to bicycle out on that side path to Scottsville, spend the weekend there drinking beer, riding your bikes around, and then ride back to Rochester Sunday evening. And the cool thing is you can still do this today. It's my understanding that the Genesee Valley Greenway is like the last vestige of that era. It's where the old side path out to Scottsville used to be. And because that Genesee Valley Greenway northern portion has been newly resurfaced, you can do that trip. You can make the trip down to Scottsville on your bike and perhaps find a good hotel and a bar to drink beer in. So the side paths, of course, went away. And I'm sorry this slide is so texty, but it's worth examining. Why did the side paths disappear? Well, James Longhurst points out in his book that the side path commissions were quasi-state entities made up of appointed members of the public commissioned to do the work of government. And that was kind of an awkward setup. It didn't have staying power. And over time, residents really did start to favor stronger, more centralized governments, along with a significant investment in public works. The reality was that the funding for the side paths, which was a user fee model, was never adequate. There was barely enough money to construct them, let alone maintain them. And this is something that Evan Friss really dives into with his book, because after the turn of the century, the bike fad just fell off a cliff. It remained common transportation, but like everybody bicycling, it just kind of went away as a fad. As bicyclists went across the state on their bikes, different rules and different tags everywhere you went just didn't make sense. And again, in the end, the idea of a single shared road system won out. The paths were paved over as roads were widened, and side paths weren't necessary anymore as road surfaces were improved. And so this is a 1904 newspaper clipping from the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, just kind of showing you that by 1904, good roads had won. And the very last sentence from this newspaper clipping is the road beds are excellent for automobile and bicycle traffic. Of course, nobody knew that automobile traffic would just kind of take over and become a danger. Back then, this was viewed by many as a victory. Good roads had won. And again, just a quick note that though the bicycle fad, took a steep nosedive, it did remain common transportation for adult workers for another 10 or 20 years. This is one of my favorite photos. This is the basement of Kodak's Camera Works building on State Street that they converted to bicycle parking. And that's from a 1906 book called Kodak Properties, which has been archived up on archive.org. But I love that picture. It's one of my favorites. So adult bicycling really does start to disappear entirely, but it makes a temporary comeback with World War II. With World War II, especially right after Pearl Harbor, the idea of rationing and conservation and saving fuel for the war effort and saving metal, it really became a patriotic thing to do, to leave your car at home and to bike instead. James, one of the things that you dive into with your book is the idea of victory bikes. Victory bikes became a very sought after item because bicycles for adults were so rare to come by in those days. And there's a picture of the very first victory bike that made its way to Rochester in 1942 or 1943. But again, this was just a temporary comeback for adult bicycle ridership in Rochester. So what else happened in the 40s? Well, here's what happened in the 40s. So this is a typical newspaper page from 1942. And here you see that there's a bunch of civic groups coming together, complaining about bicycling, urging the city to go back to having to license every single bicycle that's ridden out there. Yet you see this picture in the very middle of the page. Why was this neighborhood without power? Was it because of bicycles? No, it's because a car crashed into a pole. Grabbing for a jacket, which started to blow out the window, the driver lost control of this car in Mount Hope Avenue. The car hit the electric pole, snapping it off near the middle. The woman passenger was injured. So you have people coming together to complain about the constantly expanding use of bicycles. Yet why was this neighborhood without power? It was because of what cars are capable of. So you can't make this stuff up. In the 1950s, there was a bicycle court weekly on Saturday mornings. And again, they really wanted to have all bicyclists register their bikes and to have that license plate. And it was widely ignored, unenforced. But again, they did have a bicycle court in the 50s. And the bicycle riding ban on the sidewalk was only taken away in 1958. So in 1958, that's when Rochester started to allow people to ride their bikes on the sidewalk. And this came after a spate of awful crashes involving young children riding bicycles that were getting run over. So in 1958, Rochester said, yes, you can absolutely bike on the sidewalk. And I just want to note that this is one of the things that can distinguish us from other cities. For instance, in Buffalo to this day, you can't ride your bike as an adult on the sidewalks anywhere in the city of Buffalo, anywhere in the city limits. You can get in trouble for it. In Rochester, adult sidewalk riding is only banned downtown, but it was in 1958 when that blanket ban went away. So bicycle registration was still very much a thing. This is a recent picture from Our Community Bikes, our great bike co-op here in Rochester. Every once in a while, they'll get a bike donated to them with one of these old licenses, stickers on the bicycle frame. So believe it or not, this was in place up until 2002. It was so recent that requirement, having to go to the city clerk and register your bike and to get a bicycle license number for your bike, it was widely fragmented, ignored, unenforced, but technically it was in existence until 2002, which blows my mind. So again, some of the stuff that we're talking about here is neat and fun, and you can kind of look back on it with a nostalgic viewpoint, but there's baggage as well. So as great as the sum of this story is, there were negative aspects that we shouldn't overlook. The fact that women and people of color were barred from many bike clubs, the necessity of having to register your bike with the city clerk and to pay the accompanying fees every single year, and a speed limit on bicycles, which at one point was 8 miles an hour. Most bicycle riders today do twice that. So again, it's not all rosy stuff in the rearview mirror. So if this stuff interests you more, the great news is we are living in an incredible age of digitization. Old magazines and periodicals are being scanned for Google Books and archive.org at an enormous rapid rate. So these are all 1890s, early 1900s publications that have been digitized. They've been put up on YouTube or on archive.org and Google Books. You can search these publications for the word Rochester, and Rochester comes up a lot because we were such a groundbreaker and had so many cyclists. So check out those digitized publications. Just a quick plug for our local history bike tour. We have 4 dates this year. Space is limited for each one. Register today if you want to have some fun with other people learning more about Rochester history in general. With that, I will invite our 3 authors to come along. If you have not read their 3 books, The Cycling City by Evan Friss, Bike Battles by James Longhurst, and Old Wheelways by Robert McCullough, all of these books are absolutely worth reading, worth diving into. Each one is special and distinct in its own way. But it's at this point that Robert and Evan and James, if you can unmute yourselves and come back on here, we will dive in. So I guess for starters, my first question is, and I have some preset questions here that I'll ask the authors, and then we can have some audience Q&A after we go through these. But my first question is, have you rubbed elbows with each other before, and are you familiar with each other's work? Evan, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm very familiar with their work, and their scholarship has been tremendously helpful to my own. When I first started researching this subject as a graduate student in history, there wasn't a lot of literature on the subject, especially by serious scholars and trained historians who have different kind of methodologies. And especially when you're in the context of academia and trying to write a dissertation in order to get a PhD, I was looking for other kind of models and to learn from peers, colleagues, and others. So it was helpful. And I've run into it's a relatively small world of us historians who have written about this, although that world has grown a lot since at least the earliest of these books came out, I would say. I think I'm trying to remember, I might have first met them at an international cycling history conference, which is a really interesting space that has a lot of enthusiasts, people who are really into all sorts of a range of subjects about bike history, and a really welcoming bunch, and also kind of just odd in its kind of narrow scope in a way that is, I don't know, was fun and interesting. But that was one conference, and I've seen Jim Longhurst a couple of times at conferences. We both have been to urban history conferences and other kinds of academic stuff. So I have rubbed shoulders with them, but I'd like to see them more. Would be great.
All right. Anything you want to say, Robert or James, about how you became familiar with each other's work?
Well, we're all sort of in the same boat during this age of digitizing newspapers and journals. And it's hard to sort of figure out where to stop. So much material is becoming available. And I think that in both Evan's and Jim's cases, they were sort of innovative in using digital records and putting all that information together into arguments that are really strong And that takes a lot of skill. And so I think that I've benefited from all of that, and reading their materials and seeing how they approach that challenge of uncovering lots and lots of material and figuring out how to sort it out and pulling the best of it out into arguments that make sense.
Say that I can say that's scholarship works is it's a community of people with different ideas and takes, and sort of it's bouncing off of each other.
James, your audio is cutting out quite a bit.
I'll just say, now that I'm remembering, and while he's getting his audio sorted out, I think the first time that I virtually met Jim Longhurst was an email, and the gist of which was like, I'm glad we're not writing the same exact book. But we both had some kind of like fear when we learned that we were writing about bike history, and you know how much room was there for, again, a subject that really, to especially a lot of people outside, seemed pretty narrow.
Well, so is my audio a little better now? I had the wrong setting. I'm the problem. So that's actually one of the things I was going to talk about, is that, you know, scholarship works by bouncing ideas off of other and sort of debating. And one of the problems, certainly when I was starting to work on this, and I talked with you about this, Evan, is that scholarly historians, academic historians, did not take the bicycle seriously as a subject, and didn't think it had any meaning beyond fun. And that was a real problem and a real fear to start spending time working on something and investing sort of, you know, this is going to be my career and my advancement. If I'm going to do something that people don't take seriously and don't think of as meaningful to any larger story than simply fun and a children's toy. And I think might be hopefully a bit beyond that now. We're into the place where people are really teasing out meaningful stories about bicycles as being part of social groups and social inequality and political powers and urban design and other things. And the bicycle has more meaning now after a couple of good decades of scholarship.
That's great. So, you know, Rochester does have a place in each of your respective books. And I wanted to get a quick take on, did you come to Rochester, any of you, for your research, or was it done from afar? You can just kind of popcorn answer.
I have a good Rochester story if nobody else wants. So I have a good Rochester story, and it builds off of this question about, was the bicycle serious enough to do real scholarship and historical research on? And at the time I was living in Utica. My spouse had a job at Utica College, and I was casting around for a new subject after doing environmental history, urban environmental history research. And I had sort of lit upon, could the bicycle be a meaningful story? And I was starting to do very preliminary research, and I had been to the State Archives in Albany, and then I came over to Rochester, and I was in the public library. I was in the public library reading room, and I was doing some, as you were pointing out, some reading in the extensive newspaper coverage of the bicycles. And I was reading along, and I couldn't figure out what in the heck they were talking about. The Californian Parade, and why are they raising money, and what is happening? And I remember I was sitting in the public library reading room, and I was sort of puzzling through this, and I finally figured out, oh, they're talking about taxes. They're talking about how they don't want to, they're worried about paying taxes to the needs of bicycle path building. And I realized at that moment, I was like, oh, well, this is a larger story than just riding bicycles or the fun of a toy. this is a story about politics and power and who has the right to the city. And that was essentially the moment that I said, oh, this is actually a real story. And so it was that, and then finding Victory Bike stuff that made me say, oh, I could actually, this is worthy of my time, and I can do some meaningful research in that. And that happened in the Monroe County Public Library.
Robert, did you come to Rochester?
Yes, I did. And I can add a story too about the public library there. I was checking out, looking in different archival sources for different material on a range of different aspects of cycling history, and stopped at the city archives and inquired, and a woman there mentioned that she knew something about, that there was something about side paths in the public library, and that I should get in touch with the city historian. And so I walked over to the library and found the city historian, and she said, yes, I think we have an album of photographs that was put together by the Monroe County Side Path Commission. She wasn't sure where it was, but it was in her office. It wasn't cataloged as part of the library. And she found it and pulled it out, and it's really a gold mine. There isn't anything like it anywhere. And it documents all of the side paths in Monroe County. And so I spent an afternoon photographing those images with a camera with film in it. This is the pre-digital age. And it's really remarkable, a remarkable source. And that discovery was sort of ironic, because that very day, the city had been cutting budgets, and the city historian, I think, the city historian's job was cut. And so she and I corresponded after that. But I've always been grateful for that discovery, or the fact that she went into her office and pulled out the material.
That's great. Evan, did you come to Rochester?
Unfortunately not. And historians never like to talk about practical constraints about writing. And we like to give the impression that our exhaustive books include, turning over every sheet of paper in every library. But I started this project as a graduate student, and I was writing this kind of Pan-American story about urbanism and the way that these cycling cities formed. And so I didn't really have case studies per se, but I was trying to find examples from all over the country. And I really just had to pick a handful of cities to do deep archival research in, and try to be geographically diverse. And Rochester wasn't one of them, but I was living in New York, and not only were materials digitized, but there was a great collection in the New York Public Library from this person that I later deduced who she was, a cycling enthusiast who lived in Staten Island, on Staten Island. And she had dozens of volumes that were this thick of clippings, files, many of which had not been digitized at the time and may still not be, all related to the bicycle. And many of them were from New York and Rochester in particular. So I got a lot of stories and anecdotes for that. And also some librarians at the Rochester Public Library were very helpful in terms of specific queries that I had.
Cool. So I have two questions for each of you. Evan, I'll start with you, and if each of you can take a minute or two to respond, and then we can go to some questions and answer with our audience tonight. Evan, I'll start with you. Why did the bicycle transform American cities? What did it give residents in the 1890s that they didn't have previously?
Part of its appeal, and you can see much of it still today, was in its multiplicity of uses and meanings. So there were lots of enthusiasts who were interested in joining a club that might have been interested in joining a social club of a different variety, but this was one kind of cool new tool to assert one's identity and engage in different kind of social circles. There were people who were really interested in racing, and this provided that. A lot of people who were interested in recreation and riding the bicycle for health and exercise. And there was a growing understanding that cities were filthy, diseased kinds of places. The impetus behind the kind of 19th century parks movement was, let's build these great parks so that people could escape the city, at least for an hour or two. But part of the appeal of the bicycle was to escape for an afternoon, to be able to actually get away. And lots of the popularity of the bicycle was about touring or visiting a nearby beach or hilltop, or having a picnic, bringing your Eastman camera and, going to the wilderness. And it was also, of course, a very personal vehicle that felt very emancipatory, not just for women, but women especially, that opened up new spaces. Horses were very expensive to have, and the vast majority of urban dwellers never even considered owning one. And so in this age before the car, this was really the first option of personal transportation that seemed to unlock lots of opportunities, social, recreational, and it was also just really exhilarating and exciting. It evoked a feeling that people had never felt before. The physical sensation of riding a bicycle.
I love that answer. And I think a lot of us can identify with many of those feelings still. So, Robert, we'll move on to you. What made New York State, and Western New York in particular, such fertile ground for the side path movement?
I think a lot of opportunities for country riding. As Evan said, this bicycle provided an opportunity to escape the city. And, if we go back to the late 19th century and take a look at cities and urban areas, there was a fairly clear division between city and countryside. There were fringes, but for the most part, countryside was within easy reach, and the bicycle made it even easier to complete that transition. And I think the opportunities for country riding really helped motivate the side path, or generate interest in the side path movement. And people were, free to explore without regard to schedule or reliance on a horse or route. They could explore anywhere they wanted to, and that was an exciting experience. I think that's a lot of the explanation.
Cool, very cool. So, James, I remember when I read your book, and I was so taken with the fact that Rochester used to publish a magazine about side paths, and I put it out on social media. Isn't this so cool? And you responded by writing a blog entry about how you came to find Side Paths magazine. Can you tell us a short version of how you came across Side Path magazine?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I'd say before I get into the personal story is that this is a rare opportunity I have to speak to people in the Rochester area, and I can beg you, if anyone knows of piles of newsprint, perhaps in your grandparents' home that have not, we have precious few of these numbers of Side Paths magazine. We have no one has a complete run, and we have a small number of these, and these are fascinating magazines with a lot of information about the entire nationwide movement. So they're sort of summarizing side paths everywhere. This sort of describes the historian's research process, is asking questions a lot and being stumped and confused and not understanding what you're seeing when you're plowing through the primary sources, so the original sources that are created at the time. And I started off by reading a lot of legal journals. I was reading lawyers writing about lawsuits about injury and tort claims and who's to blame for crashes and those sorts of things. And I came across in some fairly minor legal journals, they were talking about laws related to people who had broken the side path laws, and I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. What was this word side path? I knew sidewalk, but I'd never heard side path. And they were trying to enforce a law about carriages and horses not being allowed on the side path. I was like, what are they talking about? And so I began searching for that word, and side path is nicely Googleable, and you can find it in a lot of databases. And I found, first off, advertisements for side path tags, for selling side path tags to side path commissions, and then side path rollers. And then eventually I found a advertisement for Side Paths magazine. I was like, what is this? And went through every imaginable database tool to find either archival holdings of this or if any libraries anywhere had them. And just simply could not come up with them. And I feared I would have this fragment, this advertisement that said subscribe to Side Paths magazine and nothing else. And then, like I should have done from the beginning, I went and asked a librarian, and rather quickly they found in Monroe County a very limited run of Side Paths magazine, and I could interlibrary loan that, and I scanned and digitized the small number of issues, but that really unlocked that this was a national story, and sort of unlocked this. And I went to start digging further beyond that. But it was an oddball reference in a law journal that I'd never heard of, which causes me to think, and I continue to think this. I'm not the best researcher in the world. I'm an okay researcher. I'm pretty good. But if I found stuff that people hadn't written very much about by just scratching a little bit, I still think there's a lot of hidden and forgotten history about bicycles in America, both locally and nationally, that is waiting to come out, and that has been skipped over because bicycles have not been thought of as a meaningful subject of research. I still think that about both side paths and victory bikes and other bicycle topics, is that there's many other stories that are waiting to be told. And someone with the research time could find very interesting things as well.
That's a great story. I know that so many people on this call are probably familiar with Richard DeSera, who for many decades was the godfather of bicycling in Rochester. And if there was anything that happened bicycling wise in the last 40 years, he just had his fingerprints all over it. Sadly, he passed in 2019, but he was the person that really took me under his wing and showed me the advocacy ropes and really got me plugged in. And I remember bringing up Side Paths magazine to him, and his response was, "Oh, Jesse, I had one." So he had a physical issue and he lent it to somebody years ago, and he can't remember who he lent it to. So I swear to you, like, there's somebody in Rochester that has a copy of Side Paths magazine. If you see this recording, please get in touch, because you have no idea how rare that is. And, to sound like Indiana Jones, it belongs in a museum. So please reach out. And again, if you are going through people's attics and you ever find a copy, please get in touch. So Robert, we'll go next to you. And I guess in hindsight, it's pretty easy to look back on the Good Roads and Side Path movements as being diametrically opposed to each other. But could someone be in both camps at the same time back then, or did you really have to choose one or the other?
Are you asking me? I couldn't quite hear you. Yeah.
Yes.
It's kind of an interesting topic that has connections to what's going on today. What is the proper place for the bicycle? And I think the side path movement, the people who were promoting the side path movement had it right. I think the most forceful argument was that they represented a generation of cyclists who wouldn't benefit from improvements to rural roads, and that what they wanted to do was to experience country riding then, and they went out and built a means to do that. The arguments within the LAW about the problems with the side path movement were sort of practical arguments. There were efforts to pass legislation to tax rural populations in order to improve roads, and that meant that farmers had to pay taxes to improve roads that would benefit cyclists from the city, and that wasn't very popular. And then in urban areas, there were concerns that the hard-won right to ride on roads, the 1887 Liberty Bill, would be undermined if cyclists built separate pathways and then were confined to those pathways. And so the problems played out in different ways in both urban and rural areas. I think that the issue is really still unresolved. What is the proper place for cyclists? And I think railways designed for cyclists that are more like old roads rather than bicycle paths offer the best cycling experience. And I think that at least that's the way it is around here in Vermont. So I don't know whether they're diametrically opposed or not. I think there is sort of a chaotic compromise that has always been achieved with a lot of controversy, but I think they both have merits. They both have a place, really.
Mm. So Evan, I alluded to George Eastman and how he was a cycling fanatic, but then the automobile came along and he just never bicycles again. But one of the more interesting points that you raise in your book is the cycling fad started dying before, like it started taking a nosedive even before the car came along. Can you walk us through why that fad just kind of fell so precipitously?
Yeah, I try and avoid the word fad, mostly because I wrote a book about this, and back to James's earlier point of like, is this his subject worth his serious historical investigation? I had to convince myself that it was different than a fad, like hula hoops or beanie babies or fidget spinners or something. And I think the case can be made, and that's what I try to do in the book in a way. Rochester by the end of the 1890s has 40,000 bicycles registered. And as you pointed out, many people weren't registering them. They're all over the place, and the rise is unbelievably fast to where you probably have hundreds of them in the 1880s and 40,000 of them a decade later. And 200 miles of, side paths emanating from Rochester. These are pretty fundamental changes to the land, the landscape, cities that has real effect on people's lives, and in many ways lasting effect, much more so than what I would characterize as a fad. But the sentiment, I understand the sentiment of the question, which is there's this incredible rise and incredibly steep fall. And I try and chart that in the book, and it's very easy to do. I wish there were more traffic counts because there aren't many of those, but the ones that do exist confirm the same thing, where we do have registrations and taxes and even other ways of measuring the kind of enthusiasm, the daily columns that you talked about. I don't know for sure, but I would bet a lot of money become less daily, become, weekly and then monthly and then disappear altogether, probably pretty quickly. So it's easier for me to debunk other theories, and I guess that's always the case. So, most people assume for good reason that the car replaces the bicycle because we live in such a car-dominated society. But those 40,000 people who registered their bicycles in Rochester in 1899 or whatever, in 1905, most of them were not riding anymore, and all but 2 or 3 owned a car, probably. So, Eastman is an exception. And cars don't become as popular as bicycles were until well into the 1920s. So most people are getting rid of their bicycles and not hopping into cars. But cars do play a role insofar as I think some of the excitement and novelty and innovation and kind of techno fetish kind of ness about bicycles loses steam as this sexy world-changing object once even some automobiles begin to appear on the streets. And I also think, just like the kind of more elite, wealthier people started bicycling first, in my research I found they were the first ones to stop, and it's hard to directly say that they stopped in large numbers because the bicycle was democratized and prices began to fall, especially toward the very end of the 1890s, the last year or two in particular. But I think a better theory is that as bicycling becomes popularized, as it really becomes achievable for the broad middle class, elites begin to lose their taste, cycling clubs begin to fall out of favor, and there's this kind of consequence of dominoes that keep falling that make it less cool, less fashionable, less exciting. Because of course we know it doesn't lose any practical value. If anything, bicycles continue to develop to be make more sense as a tool for commuting, and they become much, much less expensive. And as they become much less expensive, they become less desirable.
So James, in your book, you really dive into, the side path commissions themselves and how they were very oddly constructed as quasi-government entities appointing members of the public and all that. So is something like a side path commission something that we can copy and paste on to today's landscape? And if the answer is no, why not?
Well, I think that the closest similarity we have in the present are rail trails, and from state to state, a variety of rail trails will ask for a user fee trail pass or something similar. And so that fits the broad model of side path commissions, in that it's a state entity. It's also sort of dependent upon the volunteer activism of those people who friends of the trail networks. And so you can't have it without both of those things, without, at least some money coming in from a license user fee. My takeaway from looking at the failure of side path commissions is that money matters, and the side path commissions were an attempt to sort of cheap your way through the system, to get just a small number of people to pay for a public good. And that really ended up with a very weak system, not a very significant infrastructure impact, and something that couldn't survive, certainly, sorry, Evan, the fad going away. And if you don't have any users, you don't have any user fees. And, to be clear, we would not have an interstate highway system if the capital investment of the interstate highway system was based completely on user fees. Yes, it comes out of a gasoline tax, but it's backstopped by the investing power of the federal government. And we've essentially the interstate highway system has stopped paying for itself some time ago, as has the road network at large. And so I think that the lesson I take away from that is not that, hey, we should reinvent side path commissions, but rather we shouldn't do that again. That if you would like a transportation system that is equitable, that is designed for all, and is sustainable both in sort of resiliency way of thinking, and also in thinking about catastrophic global climate change, we should not be cheaping our way to that, which was what the side path commissions were trying to do. I think I got a little jumbled in that response, but I think it catches the spirit of what I want to say.
Right. I mean, it's a great response. And, I've read each of your books twice, and something that really caught me the second time I read your book, James, was about, you just mentioned the interstate highway system and how when it was created, the demand was not there. There were not enough drivers at that point to warrant that level of investment in the interstate highway system, but you build it and they will come, right? So it's the same thing with bicycles today, is it not?
And even to roll back before the interstate highway system, we go look at Clay McShane's book, Down the Asphalt Path, or Michael Fine on New York road building. And even before we get interstate highways, roads are paved and engineered before the automobile. The network is built first, and the automobile takes advantage of it. And sort of, I think that's meaningful. And it's a very easy thing for us to look backwards and miss and say, oh, the car came into existence and the roads were built. No.
So before we get to the audience Q&A, just a general question of, so in what respects have we made real progress? I mean, it was New York City that really started, a major modern investment in bicycle infrastructure in 2007, and that kind of set off the modern American bike boom. That's definitely. So, in what ways have we made real progress? At the same time, in what ways are we just fighting the same battles over and over again? How is this, what we've discussed today, relevant?
Jesse, was that to me? I couldn't quite hear a lot of the question, if that was aimed at me.
It's for all three of you. In what ways are we fighting the same battles, but in what ways are we making real progress?
Evan, I feel that's a you question.
There's, I think,
Your New York City book is more recent in a lot of ways.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of echoes of similar debates and questions. And Robert mentioned, where does the bicycle belong? And now that's become complicated. When I first wrote this book and then the second book about New York, people would ask me about scooters. Now everybody asks about e-bikes. And, the technology is constantly asserting the same question about what is actually a bicycle and where does it belong. In the 70s, the Department of Transportation, in some official report, called the bicycle the stepchild of the transportation system, like this, thing that they just don't know how to treat or deal with and where to put it. And a lot of, questions about how the similar kinds of questions about what comes first, infrastructure, demand, and how do you increase demand, and a lot of those things. And I also think the successes are very regional. If you go to New York City today, it's mind-blowing. I mean, I think City Bike is the most remarkably successful bike program maybe ever in the United States. I mean, they have record number of users, every day, it seems like, and all different kinds of people who are riding it. And many people are riding it who would never consider riding a bicycle, who had never considered riding a bicycle before. And was a program that almost universally everybody assumed would fail. And the kind of program that has failed in many other cities, many other American cities. So, you know, there's a case for that being kind of an exceptional example of progress. But if I look around sort of the small college town that I live in, it's harder to find examples of that. A college campus where bike commuting is very low among the students in the town. And I won't get into the kind of local politics, but it's a kind of divergent story, I think, today. And we can find really amazing examples of progress and other ways in which many of the same hurdles are still standing.
All right, thank you. Any other responses to that, or should we move on to the audience Q&A?
I'll just add one point to Jim's discussion, or Evan's discussion too, about the decline of the bicycle. The side path movement actually, I think, provides fairly close documentation of where and when the interest in cyclists or cycling declines or remains longer than in other places. And you can find in some of the records, side path commissions still issuing licenses in 1907, 1908. And there are interesting discussions in some of the newspaper articles about whether or not the people who are still riding bicycles in those districts, and I'm thinking of Long Island at this point, whether the people who are still riding bicycles in that district are also owning automobiles. So the side path movement has these little interesting bits of history that are sort of hidden away, and I think that provides a useful it's a useful research tool.
All right, thank you all. Daheja, did you want to hop on here and walk us through audience questions or open it up?
Yeah, sure. So it looks like James went in and answered a few questions. Michelle Mullins had 2 questions, but they were answered. So she did want to recommend the book Geronimo, Riding the Very Terrible 1914 Tour of Italy. She said that she read it and she would recommend it if you haven't read it already.
Just because I typed some responses to Michelle, I don't know if we should consider it closed, but I'm happy to have other questions from the audience.
I think the one is worth diving into a little bit. When did bikes become less for adults, yet a rite of passage for kids?
So if Evan and Robert want to think about that, I can sort of summarize one of the things, some of the responses I had there, and say that this is, well, Evan, you've covered this a little bit about the transition from the bicycle to the automobile as an interest group. And one of the only things I would add to that is I'm not certain that we've stressed enough. And Jesse, you certainly had this in the introduction, but I think it's very important for people to understand that the most politically active and pushing of the 1890s cyclists were very particularly young, upwardly mobile, white collar white men, and that political bloc and that sort of social growth. And this is not to say that there's not the bicycle is a liberatory tool for women. There's certainly new immigrant groups and African-American groups that are interested in the bicycle and its association with modernity and technology and liberatory power. But the most outspoken cyclists of the 1890s are white collar men, and they are a a big reason why the side path movement is organized and gets attention. And then they're also a reason why the side path movement doesn't get public support and public funding. It relies upon user fees. Is that these guys are already rich. They're doing this, and the farmers are not interested in paying for this because they're comparatively rich. These are upwardly mobile young city guys, and so nobody wants to pay for their recreation, and that's why there's no public funding for side paths really on offer. And the thing is that group is partly interested in bicycles in its association with modernity and high technology. There's high technology of its time, incredibly transformatory technology and speed, and then they lose interest. And they move on to motorcycles, which are just bicycles with motors strapped into them, and then into the various types of combustion and powered motorcycles. And so after that happens, manufacturers shape their advertising to the only market that really they feel is open to them, and that's children. And so for decades afterwards, advertising for the sale of bicycles is targeted towards children. And I think very strongly bicycles get associated with childhood from that point on. And this happens through advertising, and it happens through film, and bicycles become play toys. And it's a very strange situation in World War II, when all of a sudden the federal government has to try to convince people, no, bicycles are an important tool in wartime, and adult men in business suits should ride them to work. And it seems inherently ridiculous for that to happen. So in many ways, we've been working against those variety of associations. Bicycles are for rich urbanites. Bicycles are for children. Bicycles are for those who can't afford a car. All of these are different associations, and all of them are active at the same time in the present, even though they're contradictory.
Yeah, and that burden of kind of in terms of encouraging cycling today and thinking about the understanding of this as a children's toy is, I think, a large burden to overcome, and something that didn't exist in the 1890s, when the bicycle was clearly an adult device and very few children proportionally rode. And of course, it had evolved from the high wheeler, which was this very dangerous contraption and was seen as a device for adventurous kind of men. And the safety bicycle was pitched as a device for the mainstream, but even still, it was understood as something that was difficult to master and was really meant for adults. And again, one of the more remarkable things about how popular cycling was in the late 1890s was that at the beginning of the decade, none of these adults knew how to ride a bicycle. So they had to learn as adults and be willing to sort of go through that difficult process in order to become cyclists, which they did. And again, there were very few kids' bikes on the market, and it represented a very small fraction of sales. And then once it became predominant, as Jim's scholarship has shown, it became a challenge to reintroduce the bicycle to the adult market as a serious tool for commuting, as a serious device for different uses and contexts.
Yeah, it was one of the striking things that I read, reading each of your books for a second time. It's just what a recent phenomenon, in some respects, adults bicycling is. I mean, it's really the 60s that we returned to, some type of regular adult ridership, and then the oil crisis in the 70s. We can kind of assume it was always like that many adults chose to continue riding recreational, but really it was the 60s and 70s, and these new bicycles from Japan and Italy that made their way over. So so much change all the time. So any other questions or thoughts before we wrap up? Is there anything else, Jaheja?
We did not have any other questions come in.
All right, well, in sum, just thank you, Evan, thank you, James, thank you, Robert. We appreciate your scholarship. Your books are excellent. I recommend to everyone on this recording and on YouTube that you check out these 3 books. You know, at Reconnect Rochester, we're trying to make Rochester a great city to bike in once again. You know, we're making progress. We're firm in our commitment, and I hope to see you out on the roads this summer. Thank you so much.